If you can take a seat, we'll go start in just a minute. On behalf of the rector and the faculty here at NDS, we want to welcome you to this installment of the Aquinas Lecture Series. Before we begin with an introduction to the series and our speaker, Father Deo is going to lead us in prayer.
We'll now pray a modified version of a student's prayer by St. Thomas Aquinas. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, divine Creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom, pour forth your brilliance upon our dense intellects. Dissipate the darkness which covers us, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant us penetrating minds to understand, retentive memories, method, and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, an abundant grace in appropriating what we learn and expressing ourselves. Guide the beginning of our work of learning the faith, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This we ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father Deo. From Pope Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris to St. John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, the Magisterium has singled out the teaching of St. Thomas as a sure guide in theology and philosophy. Leo XIII wrote of the angelic doctor, with his spirit at once humble and swift, his memory ready and tenacious, his life spotless throughout, a lover of truth for its own sake, richly endowed with human and divine science. Like the sun, he heated the world with the warmth of his virtues and filled it with the splendor of his teaching. With regard to seminary formation, the Second Vatican Council was clear about the role that Thomas's thought should play. The decree on priestly training reads, "In order that they may illumine the mysteries of salvation as completely as possible, the student should learn to penetrate them more deeply with the help of speculation under the guidance of St. Thomas, and to perceive their interconnections." At Notre Dame Seminary, the Aquinas lecture provides us an opportunity to study and to promote the thought of the angelic doctor. The first Aquinas lecture was in 2005, and Father Aidan Nichols was the presenter. Since then, the series has hosted a who's who of Thomistic scholars, including Norris Clark, Benedict Ashley, Monsignor John Whipple, Romana Cesario, Lawrence Dewan, and last year's presenter, Ed Fazer. With our present speaker, we continue our tradition of bringing the finest scholars in Thomistic scholarship to our campus. This year's presenter is Professor Stephen Long. Dr. Long is currently Professor of Theology at Ave Maria University. His areas of scholarship and expertise are far-ranging, and for those of you that sat through the 3-hour Q&A session, you got a sense of that. He works in both theology and philosophy. His areas include Thomistic moral theology and philosophy, the natural law. In the realm of dogmatic theology, Dr. Long has written extensively on the relation of nature and grace, the theology of grace, freedom, and predestination. He also works within the areas of metaphysics, theological and philosophical anthropology, philosophy of law, Christian philosophy, and social and political theory. Important publications include the following: Analogia Entis, on the analogy of being, metaphysics, and the act of faith; Natura Pura, on the recovery of nature and the doctrine of grace; and the Teleological Grammar of the Moral Act. Add to this his more than 40 articles in journals such as The Thomist, Nova et Vetera, Communio, New Blackfriars, and the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, and you can see he's a very busy man. Here to present his lecture entitled Revelation and the Metaphysical Framework of Sacra Doctrina, please help me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Long.
I'd like first to thank Notre Dame Seminary, Dr. Liberto, the seminarians, faculty here for the wonderful hospitality and graciousness with which you've all received me, and for this beautiful occasion to think through some very important things in the light of the teaching of Thomas. Today, I will try to pursue several objects that are essentially related but rarely treated together systematically. First, I will consider the secondary object of revelation, that which is required for the intelligibility of revelation, as necessarily including not only historical and logical, but metaphysical truth. Some of these truths are medicinally revealed in Scripture, although they are natural truths. For as Thomas writes in Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, Question 2, Article 2, Ad 1, quote, "The existence of God and other like truths about God, which can be known by natural reason, are not articles of faith, but preambles to the articles. For faith presupposes natural knowledge, even as grace presupposes nature and perfection the perfectible," end quote. I will start by referring to former CDF prefect, then Cardinal Ratzinger's doctrinal commentary on the concluding formula of the Professio Fidei, a commentary on the profession of faith issued by the CDF on June 29, 1998. I will also point out the Church's consecration of certain natural principles in her teaching, principles that are not merely contingent concepts or placeholders, but whose own density of natural intelligibility is vital for the intelligibility of the doctrine of the faith. I also address here St. Thomas's teaching regarding the essential role of metaphysics within Sacra Doctrina, or theology as an acquired human habitus. Secondly, I offer remarks regarding St. Thomas's development in his work of the metaphysical framework for Sacra Doctrina, in his teaching of the analogy of being as the foundation for the analogy of creature to God, an account never announced by him, but expressed later in different language, the reasons for which he indicates. Failure to observe the reasons he provides for the shift in his language has actually led several authors in the 20th century to hold that Thomas radically altered his account of analogy, or else to hold that he doesn't have such an account. To the contrary, I will argue that he holds one formal account that universally structures his theology. Thirdly, I will address Thomas's account of the image of God, the imago Dei, in the human creature, illustrating the essential importance of the analogy of being within Catholic theology for understanding this teaching. Fourthly and finally, I will conclude with observations regarding the challenging analysis of a contemporary theologian of great intelligence and probity, my distinguished, insightful, and learned colleague, Father Guy Mancini, who has written an essay arguing that valid reasoning for the existence of God is something of nature that, owing to the effects of original sin, is only possible for man following upon revelation and sanctifying grace. Without providing the full consideration and response this challenging consideration merits, I will argue that this judgment seems deeply problematic for the intelligibility of revelation and the church's discourse with the world, that it seems unduly to constrict the dignity of the Imago Dei in man, the principle which is the created foundation for all later perfections in grace and glory, and that the metaphysical intelligibility of being itself may be seen as a sign of the transcendence of the image of God in man. All these points highlight the crucial role of metaphysical truth in relation to revelation, doctrine, and theology. The secondary object of revelation. In the CDF's doctrinal commentary on the concluding formula of the Professio Fidei, then Cardinal Ratzinger observed the distinction in church teaching between that which is formally revealed and that which is required for the intelligibility of the reception and promulgation of revelation. Regarding that which is formally revealed, the document begins by quoting the profession of faith that it is commenting upon. So it states, quote, the first paragraph states, with firm faith, I also believe everything contained in the Word of God, whether written or handed down in tradition, which the Church, either by a solemn judgment or by the ordinary and universal magisterium, sets forth to be believed as divinely revealed. It comments, the object taught in this paragraph is constituted by all those doctrines of divine and Catholic faith, which the Church proposes as divinely and formally revealed, and as such irreformable. The commentary states, a paragraph further down, quote, these doctrines require the assent of theological faith by all members of the faithful. Thus, whoever obstinately places them in doubt or denies them falls under the censure of heresy, as indicated by the respective canons of the codes of canon law, end quote. The commentary notes further that, quote, the second proposition of the Professio Fidei states, I also firmly accept and hold each and everything definitively proposed by the Church regarding teaching on faith and morals. The object taught by this formula includes all those teachings belonging to the dogmatic or moral area which are necessary for faithfully keeping and expounding the deposit of faith, even if they have not been proposed by the magisterium of the Church as formally revealed, end quote. It continues, quote, every believer, therefore, is required to give firm and definitive assent to these truths based on faith in the Holy Spirit's assistance to the Church's magisterium and on the Catholic doctrine, the infallibility of the magisterium in these areas. Whoever denies these truths would be in a position of rejecting a truth of Catholic doctrine and would therefore no longer be in full communion with the Catholic Church, end quote. It continues, quote, the truths belonging to the second paragraph can be of various natures, thus giving different qualities to their relationship with revelation. There are truths which are necessarily connected with revelation by virtue of an historical relationship, while other truths evince a logical connection that expresses a stage in the maturation of understanding of revelation, which the Church is called to undertake. The fact that these doctrines may not be proposed as formally revealed, insofar as they add to the data of faith elements that are not revealed or which are not yet expressly recognized as such, in no way diminishes their definitive character, which is required at least by their intrinsic connection with revealed truth, end quote. The document thus speaks of the truths pertaining to the secondary object of revelation as being of various natures, giving different qualities to their relationship with revelation. It lists logical connection with revelation or historical relationship to it, but does not suggest that this is an exclusive list. It is, in fact, I will argue, impossible that it should be an exclusive list. That argument begins now. Metaphysical truth and the secondary object of revelation. As part of the divine providence preparing the world for Christian revelation, classical civilization laid the foundation for certain metaphysical insights into the truth of being and nature and the relative but real transcendence of human spirit. These insights have been developed and elevated further by a long process of intellectual refinement and assimilation to the understanding of revelation. Articulated in what are called the preambles of faith concerning God and the human soul, arguably they enter into the secondary object of revelation, that is, the conditions requisite to the intelligibility of the promulgation of the gospel, although some of them are medicinally revealed, as for instance the incorruptibility of the soul, which Thomas thought to be philosophically demonstrable. Christ did not come to preach the message of the metaphysical principle of contradiction, but if the principle does not pertain to the real, a metaphysical premise, the entirety of the realism of the ascent of faith is denied in one breath. Similarly, whatever the structure of created being is, it is by divine decree rather than by human assertion, a prerequisite for and a conditioning element of supernatural revelation. Thus, theology that lacks metaphysics and philosophy of nature, or even realist ontology of knowledge, seems in danger of converting divine truths into a species of glossolalia. The Church has consecrated certain principles and insights in formulating her teaching. For example, to mention only a few, relation and procession, person, nature and substance with respect to the Trinity, substance and nature with respect to the person of Christ, form with respect to sanctifying grace, justification, and the sacraments. With respect to the moral life, one would need to observe the primacy of the Church's embrace of the natural law doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas. Principles such as end, object, matter, intention, choice, eternal law, divine law, whose intelligibility itself involves and requires metaphysical judgments. Imagine that the metaphysical intelligibility of person, nature, God, and man is subtracted from the proposition that Christ is one person with two natures, divine and human. What remains? Not to mention that the term one itself requires metaphysical explication in terms of transcendental unity. When one treats all such natural principles consecrated within the Church's teaching as lacking immutable and naturally intelligible content founded on the reality of things, even revealed truth is in danger of becoming a species of metaphor rather than a doctrine of faith, irreformable by virtue of itself. The relativization of the content of the secondary object of revelation, of that which is naturally required for the intelligibility of the doctrine of the faith, ineluctably endangers and relativizes the doctrine of the faith itself. This is precisely why overt negation or rejection of the secondary object of revelation, as opposed to simple confusion or ignorance, causes separation from communion with the Church. This is, of course, not to say that every metaphysical unclarity or error is itself immediately a cause of separation from the Church, but only that certain metaphysical truths are required for the intelligibility of revelation, and that the structure of created being enters into doctrinal consideration and questions of doctrinal development and application pertaining to faith and morals. This was the problem that catalyzed the furor regarding La Nouvelle Théologie, not merely the special role of the teaching of Aquinas, but rather the nature of church doctrine itself, and the possibility of theology as scientia, as a noble contemplation of the truth about God, unifying the truths of revelation and nature. The preambles of faith are medicinally revealed, while nonetheless they are discernible to natural intelligence. God may elevate any person in grace, but the capacity to realize that finite beings are effects of God, arguably, is a natural capacity essential to any being created ad imaginem Dei. I will return to this point, but first we must move from the inclusion of metaphysical truth in the secondary object of revelation to the essential and privileged instrumentality of metaphysics in Sacra Doctrina. To put the matter as St. Thomas does, we do not possess quantitative or direct essential knowledge of God, who is the subject of theology. A science of that which we do not essentially know sounds like a contradiction in terms. Yet even after revelation, we do not enjoy direct knowledge of the essence or quiddity of God, a knowledge which awaits the beatific vision. One recalls the judgment of St. Thomas in De Veritate, that philosophic knowledge of God should be compared with beatific knowing more as not seeing to seeing than as not seeing so well to seeing better. How then can theology proceed? Thomas's answer in question 1, article 7, ad 1 of the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae is clear. Theology proceeds on the basis of all the effects of God in nature and grace. But the proper and first effect of God is being in the sense of esse, or actual existence. As Thomas puts it in the Summa Theologiae, question 45, article 5 of the prima pars, quote, "No, among all effects, the most universal is existence itself. Thus it must be the proper effect of the first and most universal cause, and that is God," end quote. A little further on within the body of the same article, Thomas writes, quote, "But that which is the proper effect of God creating is that which is presupposed to all other effects, namely absolute existence," right? Esse absolute. The to be, or actual existing of beings, is presupposed to all other effects. On this understanding, it is only owing to esse, to be, existing, existence, translated all those ways, that ends that which exists is real, and so can be first in the intellect's conception. Esse is the most universal effect. The is in the that which is, the actuality of any and every being, and accordingly what is most formal in that which is esse, actual existing. Being in the sense of the that which is or ends as gerund necessarily is known in relation to being as esse or actual existing as verb, if you like. Thomas writes in the Summa Contra Gentiles that we naturally know being ends, that which is, as such, and its per se properties. And in De Trinitate, that knowledge of ens commune, which is the subject matter of metaphysics, precedes and is the basis for natural knowledge of God. The proposition that the proper effect of God is esse simply, esse absolute, when conjoined with question 1, article 7 of the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, establishes the privileged instrumentality and centrality of metaphysics within Sacra Doctrina. For what stands in for the lack of quantitative knowledge of God is all the effects of God in nature and grace, and the most universal effect is the most formal principle of the subject of metaphysics, that is, esse. It follows that metaphysics has a privileged instrumentality within Sacra Doctrina. And the theologian who proceeds without metaphysical wisdom risks either absorbing revealed truths into contingent conceptual constructs or social ideology, or else converting the contemplation of the truth of revelation into a species of fideist poetry, or only aspirationally connected historical moments. The actual being, nature, and substance of created things are real, and supernatural revelation is real. The continuity and relation between these can only be understood short of the beatific vision on the basis of metaphysical truth. We cannot start out within the beatific vision and see clearly therein or deduce the entirety of divine providence, creation, grace, and revelation. The principle of contradiction in its application to being is one such metaphysical principle, and arguably, it cannot be sustained as applying to many limited, changing creatures without the real division of being by potency and act, for the reasons made conspicuous by Aristotle that I'll discuss briefly in a moment. A theologian who wishes to deepen insight into the reality of nature, grace, and revelation, and who absents himself from these principles, does so at hazard to the unity and fruitfulness of theology as sacred science. St. Thomas Aquinas and the metaphysical framing of theological science. This brings us to my second consideration, that of the metaphysical framing of theological science. Here I will speak briefly about the division of being by potency and act, with its harvest of the real distinction of essence and existence in finite being, but in particular and at length regarding his account of the analogy of being as the foundation for the analogy of creature to God. Unsurprisingly, the division of being by potency and act is spoken of by Aristotle as analogical. As pertains to the division of being by potency and act, Thomas embraced and further perfected Aristotle's account. While Aristotle develops this teaching in relation to the analysis of physical being, his purpose is from the beginning the provision of an adequate metaphysical response to Parmenides. Parmenides famously held that being is self-identical and one with itself, so that plurality is unreal, that being is all there is, and outside of being there is nothing, and so nothing exists outside of being to limit it, so being is unlimited, and that being could only change by becoming non-being, but being is not non-being, and nothing is outside of it that could alter it, so that change is impossible. Of course, we look up and see a flock of many limited changing creatures flying by and conclude that Parmenides is out to lunch. But the difficult question is how to reconcile the principle of contradiction, not as a mere conceptual principle, but as a principle of being, right? With real manyness, limit, and change. Aristotle saw that there was a principle in being which is neither act nor mere negation of act, but rather potency or capacity for act, and that exists only in relation to act. And that potency explained the reality of manyness, limit, and change. Aristotle himself provides a metaphysical and not a purely physical account of this distinction. As Aristotle teaches in Metaphysics 11:9, quote, "Now since every kind of thing is divided into the potential and the real, I call the actualization of the potential as such motion." Is it right? This is in the metaphysics. The actualization of the potential as such, wherever it's found. It's not simply physical. Any actualization of potency as such is, according to Aristotle here, motion. And every kind of thing is divided into the potential and the real. That is, this division extends to everything. God is reached in his account as actus purus, pure act, but everything else is act limited by potency. I do not concur with my friend, the late Father Norris Clark's argument that the metaphysical doctrine of the limitation of act by potency cannot be found in Aristotle's teaching. In my view, Aristotle clearly understands that manyness pertains to being only owing to potentia, and that there can be but one actus purus, whereas manyness involves act as limited by potency. For example, to take one illustration, substantial form is limited to particular dimensions in relation to matter as a potential principle. The confusion about limitation is that Aristotle often refers to the potential infinitude of matter and to form as limiting in this respect. But he clearly asserts that manyness, limit, and change accrue to being by potency and absolutely do not pertain to the divine nature as pure act. Proceeding from the Aristotelian insight into the transcendence of act, Aquinas explicates Aristotelian actual nature in terms of existence as act and essence as potency and finite being, arguably something at least implied by Aristotle's thought. In any case, there seems no reason to doubt that the analogical formality of act, according to proper proportionality, a likeness of truly differing proportions, is Aristotelian in provenance and is taken up and developed by St. Thomas. As Aristotle put it, again from the Metaphysics, quote, "Our meaning can be seen in the particular cases by induction, and we must not seek a definition of everything, but be content to grasp the analogy, that it is as that which is building is to that which is capable of building, and the waking to the sleeping, and that which is seeing to that which has its eyes shut but has sight, and that which has been shaped out of the matter to the matter, and that which has been wrought up to the unwrought. Let actuality be defined by one member of this antithesis, and the potential by the other. But all things are not said in the same sense to exist actually, but only by analogy. As A is in B or to B, C is in D or to D. For some are as movement to potency, and the others as substance to some sort of matter," end quote. In De Veritate, Thomas's initial illustration of proper proportionality is mathematical, 6:3 as 4:2, which reduces mathematically to a univocal 1/2. But he quickly moves to the proposition that as sight is to the eye, so is truth to the mind. This does not reduce to one univocal object, either in genus or in species. Light is not truth, and the eye is not the mind. The illumination in question is not one thing, but radically diverse, yet proportionately identical, as each may be taken to articulate a relation of object and power, although these and the comparable act-potency relations are radically diverse. He argues that the analogy of proper proportionality, that as one thing is to what is its own, so is another to what is its own, or as A is to B, so is C to D, is the form of analogy pertinent to transcendental being, true, and other such perfections, that of themselves do not include in their definitions any material limit, as being does not of itself designate some particular limit of being, which would be a limit of potency and confine it to one particular form. A perfect univocal abstraction takes in one thing and leaves everything else out, as one takes in circularity and leaves out blue and plastic. A genus does not include the specific difference in its definition. If it did, then every member of the genus would be of that species. So if animality included the specific difference rational, all animals would have to be rational. The genus does not include the specific difference in its definition. But unlike a univocal object, being must include all its genera and species and individuals on pain of their non-existence. The being analogically common to finite things contains everything in proportion to their existence or actuality as really limited by potency, and is utterly exceeded by God, its principle, as pure act, exceeding all limit of potency. diverse existing individuals, species, and genera, all are contained within the subject matter of metaphysics. And of course, they also have to be treated logically, which Thomas does in De Ente de Sensu. As Aristotle observes, such analogy is manifest in the division of every category of being by act and potency. The acts and potencies simply aren't the same, yet are proportionally similar. In this kind of analogy, St. Thomas states, quote, no definite relation is involved between the things which have something in common analogously. So there is no reason why some name cannot be predicated analogously of God and creature in this manner. What is in question here is the likeness of different proportions insofar as they are truly diverse. As the angel is to its being, so is the frog to its. But there is no natural genus of angel frog. This is a likeness of differing proportions of act insofar as they are different, and with no limit on how different they may be, absolutely speaking. Hence, such analogy can extend to God, whose perfection is not limited by reciprocal proportion to finite creatures. While the analogy of proportionality is transgeneric and transspecific, it does not of itself necessarily rule out all real two-way proportion. Two finite beings that share no natural genus because they lack common matter, and that share only the logical genus of substance, again, angel and frog, are still as finite, separated ontologically by only a finite degree of perfection. Thus, one may determinately and ordinately possess a suprageneric, analogically greater perfection of act than the other, even though they share no common genus or species. There is hierarchy in created being. The analogy of proper proportionality, as A is to B, so is C to D, does not require finite difference, but it does not exclude it where it obtains. It simply does not require it. The difference between two finite beings is itself finite, and so a real two-way analogical proportion may be affirmed even between things sharing no common genus. As superior as angelic intelligence is to human intelligence, it is not infinitely superior. But the case is different when one moves from analogical relations within finite being to those between creatures and God. Thomas in De Veritate affirms what he affirms everywhere else in his corpus, namely, that while the creature has a determined real relation to God, God has no real determined relation to the creature, is in no way really dependent on the creature, and infinitely transcends the creature. Thus, there is not a strict two-way commensurate proportion, because God does not transcend the creature by merely some finite increment of perfection. There is a relation of one thing to another, or as he puts it, as the creature is to what is its own, so is God to what is his own. This he calls an analogy of transferred proportion, proportionis translatum, because it takes the term proportion from the case where there is a two-way, a real relation in a reciprocal proportion, and applies it to the case where only the creature has a real relation to God, and God has no real proportion to or relation of dependence on the creature. God is infinitely transcendent, pure act, and would be identically the same if there were no creation. Only a way of predicating being, true, good, and so on, which do not designate God in such a way as to limit God to the perfection of creatures, will be sufficient, namely the analogy of proper proportionality, which intrinsically affirms all the transcendental perfections of God, as identified with the unique, simple substance of God who is infinitely perfect. There is not two-way proportion here, because God is not merely first in a series, but infinitely transcends the series. God possesses transcendental perfections proportionate to the lack of constriction of any potential principle whatsoever, while the creature possesses perfection proportionately constricted by potency. And De Potentia Dei, the Summa Contra Gentiles, and other works, Thomas drops the phrase transferred proportion and speaks simply of the relation of any one thing to another as proportion, for so long as no real determined relation of God to the creature is affirmed. He simplifies his semantics and explains why. Namely, the creature is really related to God, and this may be called a proportion, although it isn't properly reciprocal. Thomas, throughout his work, that is everywhere, I don't know of a single exception to this, denies that there's a real determined relation of God to the creature. He does speak of the real attribution of the created effect to God, since the effect only is an effect as attributed to the cause. But this first requires that there be a way of affirming that God exists without treating the existing of the infinite God as proportioned to the finite, the way he early identified as proportionis translatum, transferred proportion. Thomas holds this throughout his work and explains his later use of the term proportion, not for what is reciprocal, but rather one-sided, in De Potentia Dei, the Summa Contra Gentiles, and other works. For example, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he rules out, quote, commensuration in an existing proportion, end quote. But he allows proportion to stand for, quote, any relation of one thing to another. In the Summa Theologiae, he uses the analogy of proportionality in speaking of the divine transcendence, and there are many places in the Summa, of course, where he denies that God has real proportion, commensurate proportion to the creature, real dependence, real determined relation to the creature. The analogy of transferred proportion, oh, excuse me, I have to read one more sentence here. So nowhere does Thomas, this is also important, nowhere does he unsay his unequivocal affirmation that the analogy pertinent to transcendental being true and good is that of proper proportionality. That's a huge statement. That he's talking about the very subject matter of metaphysics. He states that the analogy pertinent to it is analogy of proper proportionality. There's no revision of that statement anywhere. There's no negation of it. The analogy of transferred proportion of one to another and effect to cause between the creature and God all presuppose the analogy of being as one of proper proportionality. First, because act or existence is intrinsically affirmed of each thing, proportionate to what it is, and these proportions are diverse. And secondly, because only such analogy permits the intrinsic attribution of perfections of God in an infinitely different way from the way they are predicated of creatures. When extended to God, two-way reciprocal proportion cannot obtain because God is not determined in proportion to the creature. God is to what pertains to God as the creature is to what is its own. Proportionality, not proportion understood as a commensurate relation. Thomas's semantics alter, but the framing role of the analogy of proper proportionality with respect to being does not. One sees this understanding in play in the doctrine of the creation of man according to the image of God, ad imaginem Dei, so the imago Dei in the human creature. St. Thomas's understanding of the imago Dei, the image of God in the human creature, has been subject to a misunderstanding that has been applied in diametrically opposite ways. Some, I would name Jacques Maritain in his seminal work, The Person and the Common Good, seem to err in reducing the analogical pure perfection of person in man to the imago Dei, understood as simple intellectual nature. Others, I would suggest Karl Barth or Edith Stein, seem to err in the opposite fashion by supposing the imago is identical with the analogical perfection of person as complete substance of a rational nature, and thus including matter and bodily perfections. Both are incorrect, I wish to argue, in supposing that person and imago are the same. According to Thomas, the imago is found in man, quote, sola natura intellectualis, only according to the intellectual nature as a purely immaterial principle. He clearly holds that all else in the human creature pertains to the imago only as an accidental quality and by way of trace, by which he means a likeness that does not attain to the perfection of an analogical image. The analogy of person as a pure perfection regards the integral or complete substance of a rational nature. And in the human case, this integrality essentially includes matter and bodily perfections. But the analogy of intellectual nature, the imago Dei in man, as a pure perfection, excludes materiality, excludes the sense powers and bodily perfections. Thus, the imago Dei is an analogical pure perfection, extrinsically limited by matter in the human person, predicated with differing limitations of potency of man and angel, and affirmed perfectly in the firstborn of creatures, according to proper proportionality. The intrinsically spiritual soul, while limited by potency and accordingly imperfect in its actuality, is nonetheless such as to provide an analogical image of God in the human creature precisely because it is positively immaterial. Without this foundational principle of spirit in the human creature, the elevation of the human person to the beatific vision would be as impossible as the bestowal of the beatific vision to a rock. The rock would need substantially to change into a knowing and loving creature to be susceptible of elevation to the order of grace and the attainment of a union of knowledge and love with God. Owing to the imago, the intellectual nature, the human creature does not need to lose humanity in order to be elevated through grace to attain to this vision. Under the active agency of God, the natural universality of its intellective power is capable of higher actuation. The overflow of the beatific vision into the flesh is required for the sake of integral human nature, but the beatific vision is essentially possessed even by the separated soul. To repeat, in Summa Theologiae, question 93, article 2, ad 3, Thomas says that the intellectual nature alone is to the image of God, sola natura intellectualis est ad imaginem Dei, and that it has a capacity for the highest good. Quae est capax summi boni? What kind of capacity is this? Those who know Thomas's teaching realize that he adverts to obediential potency, a passive potency for perfections that may be brought forth in a creature by an extrinsic active power. The universality of the adequate objects of intellect and will manifests what, consequent on revelation, we realize to be a purely passive capacity for elevation to the beatific vision, a vision toward which Thomas teaches that no creature can move apart from grace. See, for example, Prima Pars, question 62, article 2. All the nobler perfections of the imaging of God in and by the human creature, the perfections of the imago gratiae, the image of grace, and of the imago gloriae, the image of glory, presuppose the intellectual nature. The stakes at hazard are thus great in understanding that the human creature is created ad imaginem Dei by reason of that which is noblest in the human person, the intellectual nature in its openness to the universe of being true and good. And the imago is predicated by analogy of proper proportionality of man, angel, and God. Although we may say that there is a hierarchy of analogically finite distance between the perfections of man and those of the myriad angelic host, this is only because of the varied limitations of potency. God has no determined finite proportion to the creature, but the creature is ordered determinately to God. The imago and the intelligibility of creation. I wish to close by adverting to the reasoned dispositions of my profound and truly insightful colleague, Father Guy Mancini, who is inclined to hold the thesis that the knowledge of the reality of God is a natural possibility for man, foreclosed by sin but opened up again by the reality of revelation and sanctifying grace. His analysis is articulated in his essay, Why Revelation Gives Shelter to Metaphysics in Nova Vetera from 2020. Although one might argue with his conclusion on the grounds of positive theology in interpreting the teaching of Vatican I, that natural knowledge of God, our Creator and Lord, is truly possible, this does not yet reach the heart of his thesis, for he wishes to affirm that it is natural, but natural in the way that the full extent and density of natural virtue is natural after the fall. That is, post-lapsarian man will require sanctification of this recovered nature. So just as we may have virtue in a certain sense naturally, but we won't have the unity of the virtues naturally outside of the orbit of grace, and that's something natural, he wishes to say, well, this is in its substance natural, but it's something that is only recovered consequent on revelation. It's arguable whether the authors of Vatican I meant this, but the reading of natural in the light of the wider tradition poses a question that arguably has not been specifically and definitively addressed, so there is dispute in positive theology here. Systematically, the consideration is a theological exploration of the feasibility of a moderate and insightful pruning back of Thomistic apologetic optimism regarding natural knowledge of God. It is a challenging consideration. It might be thought to be in some way profoundly consistent with the Thomistic emphasis upon the efficacy of the divine motion and grace in healing and restoring nature. Further, Father's treatment is genuinely brilliant in mapping out precisely where and how this consideration fits integrally within the state of the tradition. It's just masterful in that respect. I'll be reflecting on this analysis for a long time, but I do wish to suggest there are problems. There is an argument to be made simply from the natural knowability of the premises of arguments for God and their implications. That is, it does not seem impossible to know these premises naturally. It may be said that the cloud of sin and death morally undercuts such knowledge, but conversely, it may also be pointed out that the judgment that things flow forth from God, who is infinitely good, is even in the face of sin and death, such as to suggest the thinkability of an indeterminate more, which of course in fact comes to be realized beyond all determinate natural expectation in supernatural revelation. Thomas famously said, quote, I answer that not only does faith hold that there is creation, but reason also demonstrates it, end quote. There is also a question whether the thesis is consistent with the fact of the case. Have not persons in mortal sin come to hold prior to their conversions and on the basis of ordinary experience and reason that God exists? There's a possible concern with circularity. One may be moved by grace without knowing demonstrations for the reality of God. Yet the natural motion of the mind articulated by these demonstrations precedes these, just as natural reason precedes the development of logic. If such knowledge is possible only by grace and not by natural reason alone, if the reason absolutely needs grace to see this, there is at least danger of an intellectually vicious circle. However, in closing, I wish to pose an issue that pertains to the imago and to the intelligibility of revelation. The intellectual nature, the imago, extends to being, which is the first intelligible, as sound is the first audible. The universality of its range and object renders it in relation to the active power of God to be a passive power for divine elevation to grace and glory. The natural power of intellect extends to the universal being common to finite effects, and thus to the question of the cause of this being. The premises of argument for the reality of God include no proposition knowable by revelation alone. How then can it be impossible for the intellectual creature to discover this apart from supernatural revelation? If it were impossible, would the minimal conditions for the intelligibility of revelation be able to be articulated or to be grasped by the human mind? Since being is the first proper and most universal effect of God, it is also in this life that, in terms of which effects as effects are intelligible. Accordingly, the validity of reasoning from finite effect to God, from universal being to its cause, from per accidens to per se, from imperfect to perfect, is something of nature available to intelligence to understand. Were finite effects as depending on and pointing to God naturally unintelligible, absent revelation, the rational communicability of the very idea of revelation might itself seem to become endangered, such that no middle term of conversation could exist between the church and the world. Revelation in this life is a created grace, as is indeed the humanity of Christ, as subsisting uniquely in the person of the eternal Word. But understanding this itself requires prior capacity to see that finite created effects depend on their divine first cause. The intelligibility of the faith requires this, but one might think the capacity for it proceeds from the foundational character of the intellectual nature as that in which the imago Dei in man essentially consists. One essential sign of the universality of human spirit is arguably the inherent natural intelligibility of being. But that intelligibility is not itself a supernatural mystery. It is not for historically antiquarian reasons that one observes that Aristotle affirmed that God as first cause has no real reciprocal dependence on anything, implying that God absolutely transcends limited beings. Aristotle speaks of God as producing motion as being loved, indicating both efficient causality, production, and being loved, or the final causality of God as end. Indeed, Aristotle named God analogically from what Thomas later identifies as that wherein man is created ad imaginem Dei, namely spirit, the intellectual nature as pure perfection. God is pure act, pure intellect knowing itself, with all the imperfections of Aristotle's account. For example, his failure to treat the intellectual perfection of will, that is love in God, or his erroneous conviction of the demonstrability of the eternity of the world. His affirmation of divine simplicity and transcendence nonetheless implies the divine aseity. It is incompatible with the view that God is merely the first member of a series. While the trail of created effects leads to God, according to Aristotle, God also stands absolutely outside the series. Aristotle speaks of these things employing the analogy of the proper proportionality of act and potency. It seems difficult to attribute these insights to sanctifying grace in him, although surely it was a limited but actual grace. Conclusion: the spiritual power in man testifies naturally to many things whose ultimate exegesis will be provided only by faith. But one might think one must truly be able to speak of them for that exegesis actually to obtain. The illumined page cannot be written in invisible ink. This is the gravamen of the account of Sacra Doctrina and the apologetic derivative from it and promulgated in Aeterni Patris, which turns our minds to St. Thomas Aquinas, not for parochial, but for evangelical reasons. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some Q&A, about 15 minutes. Do we have a microphone that we can use for that? Is that correct? So please come up to the microphone. Again, make sure you limit yourself to one question and keep the question rather terse. We appreciate that. Here comes the mic. Just come up to the front right here, and Dr. Long will field your question.
Dr. Long, thank you so much. My question is about the Imago Dei. As you said, that Maritain errs on one side, and there was maybe an emphasis of the bodily nature on the other side.
Right.
So where is the mean that you see for the Imago Dei?
Yeah. Well, the claim would be that the pure perfection of person is that of the complete nature, the nature of a complete rational substance. So in the human person, that includes bodiliness. The pure perfection of the imago is the intellectual nature as a pure perfection, simply ruling out bodily nature. So one could think that they're identical in one of two ways. One could say, well, the complete perfection of person is just the perfection of the intellectual nature, which moves off in a sort of Platonic dimension. One can think, well, no, the imago is the person, and that includes the bodily nature. And this is where you see Barth putting submission into the Trinity, because it becomes a way of addressing the unilateral uxoral submission in marriage. Or Edith Stein, with whom I have some sympathy, actually. She went at this in a Thomistic anthropological way, but placing all of the causality of the sexual difference in the soul, right? But both of them share this premise that the perfections of person and of the imago have to be the same. They're not the same. I mean, Thomas, it seems to me, is very clear they're not the same. So that's the mean, that you understand the perfection of person. The pure perfection of person is complete substance of an intellective nature, if you like. The complete, so in the human person, bodily perfections. The imago is the pure perfection of intellectual nature in precision from everything else. Sola intellectualis natura.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Dr. Long. My question is also on the Imago Dei. And going off of what David said, you're saying that essentially the pure perfection is per se of the intellectual nature solely.
As imago.
As Imago Dei.
Right.
So in the beatific vision is, what's the relation of you spoke of an overflowing. So what is the relation of that pure perfection to the physical component of human nature?
Well, it's the principle of the bodily beatification, right? I mean, the separated soul has the visio, essentially has the visio. But on the side of the subject, the complete subject is not yet beatified, right? So bodily creatures receive the visio by the overflowing of the grace of the visio from intellect and will into the flesh. And that's required on the side of the unity of the person, right? But the visio as such is still had essentially even by the separated soul, right? And which is not a person, but is, you might say it's personal, or you might even say it's a person in virtute. That is, because the the existence in which the rational soul subsists is numerically the same existence of the composite, Thomas says. So it's a really, there's a student who just did a dissertation on this, Daniel Lenman, on the account of the soul after death. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Yes, Dr. Long. I noticed that a lot in today's heavily pragmatic society. It seems that the question of the truth of God is not something that's either true or isn't, but something that's increasingly seen as irrelevant. Now, I'm wondering if you have any tips with how we can maybe dialogue with people of that mindset so as to help them to see the truth of God.
Right. Well, there isn't, I mean, if people are given over enough to sort of dissolutive things, it's not as though there's some kind of magic bullet of argument that you can fire at them that will, you know, activate their soul. But it is true that people ordinarily living who are reflect at all do get around to wondering what the point of the whole thing is, right? And so at those moments they are prone to reflection, it's not as though I have a certain sympathy for an awareness that some people think when you have a demonstration you can use this like an axe, you know. Remember in the Confessions when Augustine says that Monica wanted someone to unteach Augustine of all the falsehoods, and the guy's saying, I'm not fit for that. Brought skiing into the Olympics, and he was an agnostic, a very bright fellow, had a famous dispute with, what's his name, Ronald Knox, who was the premier controversialist in England at that time. I mean, everyone thought that. Agnostic, skeptics, everyone thought that because it was true. And he had a dispute with him about God, and a lot of people thought he held his own and maybe won. Then a few years later, he quietly converted. And he said in his book about this called Now I See, he said, you know, I go to these meetings and religious and priests are always saying no one was ever moved by an argument for the existence of God. And he said, I always have to be the idiot in the room who raises his hand and said, well, I was, you know. So there is this, it's not a cure-all, but it's a truth about the human condition. And one can't advert to things. One can't make anyone notice. That's grace. This is all orchestrated by grace. Actual grace and sanctifying grace, right? But many times an actual grace is something natural in its substance. If you're in the desert and you're praying for water, and you get water, you thank God for it, but what is it? It's a natural good. You know, our Lord raises Lazarus from the dead to what? Biological life. He raises the one child and he says, get the kids something to eat. It's had a rough week, you know. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I had a question about the position you were responding to at the end of your talk there. I'm having trouble understanding how one could hold the position you were responding to and still uphold the statements in Vatican I.
Right. Well, that's a dispute about positive theology, right? In other words, I think there is an argument in positive theology that it doesn't mean this, and that you'd have to go through not only other uses of the language in Vatican I, but talk about the positive theology of who wrote it and the tradition. But bear in mind, I mean, what he's done here is I mean, I don't concur with the analysis, but it's brilliant, and in that way, it's an incredible service to think this through more profoundly. Traditionalism was condemned in certain of its outcroppings, but it was never condemned simpliciter. And he's not denying that there is natural knowability. His claim is that natural knowability is affected by the fall. And so, you know, you can see that you've got the set piece the makings of a set piece battle of exegesis of the positive theology of Vatican I. But I think that the best way to take it is as an invitation to appropriate even more profoundly what you might call the mode of reading of this that is that of Attorney Patris, right? But it's not as though it's unthinkable. I think, he's mapping out in the tradition. He's found the one leaf on the tree that can hold the cicada. It's just heavy enough. The wind could blow it off. But, you might want to say the cicada can't live there very long, But so that's brilliant. And the other side of this is that he wants to argue that there's a way in which metaphysics and natural theology have a home in the Catholic life that is sui generis. Because this is where, you sort of plug it in and you see, in living color, what it can mean, what it can do, So there are positive things about it too. I share your inclination to think that Vatican I, I share the inclination to think that's not the way to read it. But I would have to admit that there's the ground to make the arguments, put it that way.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, sure thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Long. This isn't a question, but it's a compliment, first of all. For the last 47 years, I've been hearing about Thomas and teaching, obviously, and I really appreciated, in this day and age, what you were saying. Second, I'm wondering what you would think, just what you said tonight. As a young brother, one of our professors said something that, summarizing the gift of faith, it gives us a special knowledge of God we could never have, beyond knowing God exists. It gives us a special knowledge about ourselves, namely the sacramental character we receive. And finally, it gives us a special knowledge about the reality of human life. For example, John Paul II, a Christian meaning of human suffering.
Huh.
But I was thinking about this as I was listening to your talk. Would you see kind of that basic
Oh, no, I think that's very profound. I would take that to be a profound expression of what obediential potency is.
That's what I think myself.
Yeah,
but-
yeah. I mean, I use the image in one paper of the stained glass, which would be of the same nature if there were no light. But under the actual exigence of the light, it irradiates those glorious colors. It's not as though the nature of the stained glass alters whether there's light or not.
Exactly.
But you see the glory of which it's capable under the extrinsic agency of the light. And I think this is exactly true. And faith isn't merely fiduciary, right? We assent to genuine truths about God, articulated to us by God in revelation, using language that God himself knows to be analogically appropriate, befitting, right?
And what you're saying,
I'm sorry?
no, just what you're saying reminds me this moment, not to take any more time, when Pope Benedict was saying that some people think faith is like seasoning you put on the top of a salad. Other way around. It's the foundation of life, and it's also the very top of life.
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, we're created in grace. I mean, Thomas, the only one of the fathers I know who thought that there was creation, a first moment of creation apart from grace is Bonaventura. And then there was a second moment of grace. But Thomas, with all the fathers, holds that man is created in grace from the beginning. And so while there is this proportionate realm of natural goods proportioned to the nature and its active powers in itself, from the beginning, this synthesis is wider and more profound. And the end is the beatific vision. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Long. That was enjoyable. Just quickly, if you want to revisit, so the terminological shift from an analogy of transferred proportionality,
Yeah.
and then what followed that, and kind of.
Sure. I mean,
and you
this
applied-
is happy news, because in reality, you could say there are a few shifts, right? There's the shift from univocal quantitative to analogical, but not in a genus or species. And then there's the shift from that, which still allows two-way proportion to the creature and God, where it's only one-way proportion. And all of that is covered by this language of transferred proportion, right? But you see very clearly how this analogy of proper proportionality, which is the language of the proportion of actual existence to natures limited by potentia as the foundation of our thought, also allows us to affirm truths with respect to God without claiming that they have a genuine reciprocal or commensurate proportion to the creature. And, Thomas, even in the places where he's thought to be leaving that behind, right, in the Summa, in his treatment of analogy, he says our knowledge of perfections incomprehends and is exceeded by the way they're found in God, and implicitly exceeded by no finite quantum framework at the beginning. And then he points it out for a while, and then he points out a little more on why he's using it, and then he just uses the language as he indicates.
Yeah, I found that helpful because I've come across that term once or twice, and I wasn't quite sure what he was doing there, and so that was very helpful. In your opening comments, you mentioned a contrast with that, scholars who have a different reading on that.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to
Well, there's some
briefly speak to
brilliant
that.
minds who just don't agree, of all kinds. There's some who have argued that analogy is solely logical. I love de Koning. I think he's just wrong about this. Ralph McInerney, I think he's just wrong about this. In fact, I spoke with him on the phone about this shortly before he was diagnosed with cancer. He said, "Steve, just leave me out of your book." I said, "Ralph, I can't. You're too important." Montaigne, right, who's a really profound Dominican theologian, philosopher, but who opposes these. A lot of people think of it as though you have to oppose one form of analogy or the other. I think analogy of proportion and analogy of one to another and effect to cause are all fine, but they're read within the analogy of being. That's how they function. And you can explain it, right? I mean, so analogy of proportionality requires no finite distance between the analogates, but where there is such a distance, you do have an analogical proportion. The angel is not infinitely more perfect than I am. Doesn't matter much because he's a hell of a lot more perfect, but and yet it allows pure perfections which do not include any material limit of potency in their designation, as being doesn't designate non-being, true doesn't designate false, good does not designate evil. Of themselves they designate no given determinate mode. Well, these perfections thus are such as to allow of being predicated of God by proper proportionality. Yeah, it's a beautiful teaching. It's a wonderful teaching. I'd be fine doing this a long time. People want to eat dinner. I don't know.
Join me in thanking our speaker tonight. Thank you for coming, and have a good night.